and endeavour to see what I'm reading with one pair and see members on the front row with another pair, then you'll appreciate that I might have some little difficulty. But I'm grateful for everyone's forbearance over the last fortnight or so since I had a little accident, and I'm actually grateful to be able to get out and about and do the things I like to do and serve the public in the way that they expect me to. So welcome to members, officers and our independent members who have joined us. And there aren't, oh yes, there's one member of the press. Good evening. So welcome to the Constitution and Standards Committee. Now, I'm wise to read out to you the notice that precedes all committee meetings. This meeting will be webcast and a record retained on the Council website for up to 2 years. By participating in this meeting, you are consenting for your name, the content of what you say, and your image to be broadcast and stored to the Council website. If any member, officer or member of the public addressing the committee has concerns with this, please contact the committee services officer immediately. For those of you at home viewing the webcast, I'd like to inform you that if you look above the video, you will see a Resources tab. Select this tab and a link to the agenda will appear on the right-hand side. And this will allow you to open the agenda in PDF form and follow the discussion and debate. Now, for members present, can I please remind you that you need to turn your microphone on when speaking, otherwise what you say will not be captured on the webcast. And please can I also ask that members turn their microphones off when not speaking to avoid microphone feedback. And that has reminded me to turn the volume down in case any emails come in and make pinging noises whilst the meeting is in progress. It's very distracting. I move on to apologies for absences, that's all right to everyone. Councillor Janet Williamson has sent her apologies and Councillor Jean Robinson is deputising, so welcome and thank you, Jean. Councillor Paul Hayes has sent his apologies and Councillor Tom Anderson is deputising, so also welcome, Tom. Thank you very much. Now, we have got here, the next section is member declarations of interest. So I now invite any members with any disclosable to declare any disclosable pecuniary interests in connection with any items on the agenda and to state the nature of the interest. Any members wish to draw my attention to anything? No? No? Then none have been declared, then thanks very much. Now, we had a meeting on the 23rd of June. We have the minutes for that in our pack. And I'm asking members if they would like to prove the accuracy of those. I'm looking for a proposer and seconder of those minutes. I've got them in front of me from 23rd of June, and I'm looking for a proposer.
I'll move as a true record, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Fowkes. Can I have a seconder, please? Someone who was present, of course. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Steve. Councillor Williams, thank you. So, proposed and seconded. Are members content that those minutes are right? We received them? Yep, by assent. Thanks very much. Have we been notified of any? We have no public questions, no statements, no petitions. So thank you very much for that. Item 5 is entitled on the sheet Dispensation. It's fair to say that this has involved some discussion amongst members to understand quite what it entailed, but also what the implications might be. We have had exchanges, telephone and email conversations to make sure we all understand the background to this across all the work of the council. You remember there have been meetings like last December where we discussed pay in the health service and a number of members declared interests. So that principle is established and was last December for that particular meeting. But Mr McCourt has written for us a detailed report about the ins and outs of this, and that report has regard to the changes that are currently working their way through Parliament, both the Commons and the Lords, relating to the integrated care service relating to the boards that will be set up by that. And because that involves the NHS in general, there are some principles that I'd be grateful if you could set out for members, Mr. McCourt. Now, after that, we can have some discussion, but I'm thinking that there might be some wisdom, if need be, to adjourn to take some stock of what's been said at an appropriate time. But I'll ask Mr. McCourt to introduce the item, and I'll turn my microphone off so I don't disturb everyone.
Thank you, Chair. You have before you, members, a report from myself discussing members' conflicts of interest and a request for dispensation. My apologies to Councillor Camphor in that in many ways I have hijacked his particular interests because it was a discussion he was having with ourselves as a new councillor about how his impact, how his position, both as a primary care general practitioner and a representative of the BMA, impacts on matters of the council's business when it refers to the National Health Service. From that is the realisation, as it were, that the changes that are going on within the NHS leading up to next year have an impact across the whole of the National Health Service. So to date, when a member has a direct interest in that they or their spouse are an employee of an NHS body, for example, or more of an indirect interest where it's a close associate or a member of their family, we've looked at those things on a case-by-case basis. So what's their particular position in relation to a particular NHS trust? And it's quite rare that there is an item of business that affects all members associated with the NHS. And you'll have seen that we've had an example of that when the council discussed NHS pay, in which case so many members would have declared a prejudicial interest and had to leave the room that it impacted on the council's ability to have a fair and politically balanced debate. And therefore, a dispensation was asked for and applied. Indeed, in your new Code of Conduct, there is built into it a standard dispensation for those councillors who are members of NHS governing bodies. So if they're on a trust governing body, that is a dispensation that will not create a prejudicial interest requiring that member to leave the room. What has changed, or what is about to change, is as a result of the health and care bill going through Parliament at the moment, which is described as the greatest change of NHS financing and management since its inception. And indeed, the abolition of clinical commissioning groups, who are the body that holds contracts with primary care, for example, is transferring to integrated care boards. Those integrated care boards are going to be given the ability to delegate their functions to, amongst others, local authorities or act in partnership with local authorities. And therefore, your position as councillors in debating the reorganisation of the NHS and indeed the council's part in it, both as a formal scrutiny body, because our partnerships committee is the statutory scrutiny committee for this council. It carries out this council's statutory scrutiny functions on behalf of the locality in relation to all matters of the NHS and in other committees of the council when it will come to pooled funds, shared arrangements with practitioners and provider bodies and so forth, that we will soon enter into quite a complex web of having to sit down with a number of councillors to work through their interests in certain ways. And so what I have put before you this evening is a suggestion that a dispensation be granted. And that's really on three grounds. So firstly, that these are two arms of the public state dealing with the same pot of money. And it's that very reason as to why you have built in a member gets a dispensation for being on to the NHS body and the local authority body. The second is the impact. As described, this is a wholesale change. There is a consideration of what will become the Integrated Commissioning Board as to their consideration of the maturity of shared arrangements and setting up new arrangements with ourselves, with primary care and indeed larger acute trusts, albeit that they have more of a direct relationship. And in that national framework, actually, the impact of an individual councillor, frankly, whether biased or not, is not going to have make a huge difference, is the argument. And then thirdly, which is quite pertinent because there are a number of examples up and down the country, is that even if you were to say that councillors do have an element of bias because of either their personal or their associates or families' interests within NHS and the NHS working practices, actually the contribution that those members can bring because of their experiences outweighs that bias that may be introduced. So for those three reasons, the suggestion from myself is that there is a general dispensation granted in relation to members and the NHS over the coming period. Chair.
Thank you. I hope that's been a useful introduction, because the picture is changing, not as we speak, but as things progress. Only today I came across an article in the Health Service Journal which talked about progress within the Merseyside Cheshire ICS towards choosing or assessing which of the partner organisations, areas, whatever you're going to call them, was in a better prepared state to have some delegation of budget to them. And I have no idea where we are particularly in that. I did watch Councillor Robinson exploring this great work the other night at Partnerships Committee, and there's a lot of work still to be done on that. So the picture changes. As members, we've always exercised great care and caution in the way we've acted when we think we might have interests in something. I once remember 30 odd years ago working in a bookshop when there was a debate about value-added tax charged on educational books, and I had to leave the chamber, which is going back a good few years. So we've always been very cautious. But as things are changing around us, we need to try and keep abreast of those changes, which is work for members, but work for officers. I mean, the first thing, a general dispensation might speed up a council meeting, you forgive me, because debating time is short, but having a lot of members getting up and making their individual declarations does take time, but is the proper thing to do at the moment. So whatever happens, dispensation or not, we have to take account of how that's done. And then the second thing is that if there is the kind of delegation, then there may well be things that members of adult social care and public at a committee. However, I've strayed into going into detail. I think it's wise if I ask members for questions on what you said, Mr. McCourt, so that we can perhaps go around the room, and I'll have to look for hands going up, I'm afraid. To Councillor Cox, I saw you first. Now, put these glasses on, I can see you over there. Thanks very much. I'll turn my mic
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to start by just talking about what you've just said with regard to the time for particular meetings to take place because of declarations of interest. I think that's probably one of the minimal problems, to be honest, that some of the health-based committees are actually going to find themselves in. I think there's and Mr. McCall will have to come in on this as well. Is there not a possibility that a committee that has been convened, and let's be absolutely honest, that many of the members who are actually on the Health and Wellbeing Board or adult social services, etc., they have a specific interest in those particular items, and many of them have connections to the NHS or even work for the NHS. And I can see a situation coming where the general dispensation, if it's not granted, whereby the committees are no longer quorate for various decisions, rather than it just being a declaration. You can't make a declaration that you have a pecuniary interest and then continue within that particular meeting anyway. And as Mr. McCourt's just actually said, it isn't individuals with direct or potential direct pecuniary interests, financial gain. It's also family members. Some would argue if the general public, it's what the general public's view would be of what is reasonable. It could be your extended family, and if you were going to be voting on something that could directly affect how payments are made to different bodies that will be providing the integrated services, it's arguable that you should remove yourself from that debate. So you could very easily find yourself without the general dispensation, where we're no longer quorate, which will cause untold issues, no doubt, for each of these health service boards. With regard to the specific dispensation that has been suggested by Mr. McCourt because of previous issues that have taken place, there's been arguments for and against as to whether that should be granted to that specific member at this time. Again, my concern would be for members who have vital knowledge of the inner workings of the NHS. And it has been, other members have suggested that that's what officers are here for, to provide specific data and information and expertise, and this is true. But if that were just the case, that we only listened purely to officers, then we wouldn't be here at all. We would be surplus to requirement. The whole point is that we give a slightly different, nuanced view, and many members have a specific and quite in-depth knowledge in different areas because of their work and life, and I would hate to see anyone excluded specifically because of their employment or connection with the NHS. And this is going to be a really difficult one, and I think something that Mr. McCourt has mentioned again outside of this committee is with regard to, ultimately it is two arms of the state that are going to be working together, but also debating how services will be delivered. And it's not a situation whereby the council will be determining whether a private entity, for argument's sake, were to take a specific contract. We're talking about a negotiation between the NHS and the council, which are two arms of the state already. So I would hate to see anyone excluded, but I'd like to hear from Mr. McCall with regards to the potential for non-quorate committees, if possible.
I would take that point. I have seen Moira signal before, but if we take the answers to that, we take this bit by bit, if I may, rather than pile up questions.
By all means, Chair. So it may be most helpful, members, just to run through the ultimate test for whether a member can stay in the room or not. So that is, number one, will the item of business before the council affect their financial interest or well-being? So there are various things about someone's working practices, for example, that could affect someone's well-being. Is that to a greater extent than it affects the financial interests or well-being of the majority of inhabitants of the ward or the council's area by that decision, which brings us to that personal interest. And then the key element is, and a reasonable member of the public, knowing all of the facts, would believe that it would affect their view of the wider public interest. So this is always about someone's personal elements being not getting in the way of their ability to act in the public interest. When looked at in that way, the ICS, or were this a generic debate, could affect a large number of councillors. I don't consider it will be so many as to affect the quorum of any committee or the council, because that's 25% quarter, and so actually it's unlikely to affect over 3/4 of any committee. But what it would do, particularly in a council like this, where the political groups are quite finely balanced, could affect that political balance within a group, and therefore impact on a decision that would not have happened were those councillors not required to leave the room.
Chair, if I may. So I'm going to try not to monopolise this debate, but that's exactly what I was getting at. So even if we didn't lose a quorum within a committee, as you say, which is unlikely but possible, the legitimacy of those decisions at those meetings will no doubt be called into question, and there are members who really need to consider just how, without making this political, because it's pretty clear that there will be certain parties that are probably most likely to be affected more severely than others around the table. So we really need to give it some serious consideration as to whether we believe a dispensation, general dispensation, is actually in the council's best interest or not.
Councillor Cox. I saw Moira, and I'll just see if anyone else is signalling. Moira, then Councillor Jones, and then Councillor Robinson. Is that all right? Yeah. Thank Moira, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. And the first thing I'd like to do, Chair, is to thank you and Mr McCourt for the amount of work that you've put in, and especially in the last week or so, as we spent quite a long time, the spokespersons of the committee, discussing this, and it's been the cause of a lot of thought and actually a considerable amount of angst, I think, from all of us. And I personally am very uncomfortable about talking about an individual in detail in public, so I'm really going to try and avoid doing that as much as possible. But my starting point in looking at this was just basically to say, what's the point of the declarations of interest? And obviously, declarations of interest are there to reassure the public that members are acting correctly in the way that they do the business of the council. And it has actually also, crucially, to protect the councillors themselves from straying over the line, perhaps inadvertently, and behaving inappropriately or even incorrectly. And in fulfilling those two functions, it actually protects the council's integrity. And I think that's got to be where our starting point in this is. I'm looking at the very early stages of the ICS, aren't we? We're actually just in the foothills. We don't really know what we're going to be asked to do. We've got an idea of how things will pan out, but we've no idea of the details of how that will be. We are very early stages, and because of that, and because of the uncertainty of where we're going, I would say that to consider any kind of dispensation at this time is not the right time to do it. I think we may have a clearer picture of how we need to give dispensations if they need to be given further down the line. So I would hope that committee, when they come to make a decision tonight, would say, yes, we understand all the reasonings why people might want dispensations, and we certainly value the input of those people who've got special knowledge and experience, but it's not the right time at this time to change the arrangements that we've got, and we will review them after the start of the next municipal year, and that's what I hope will come out of tonight, and that is based on a lot of toing and froing in my own head, and I know other members have had the same difficulty, so I hope you'll receive those in good faith. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I call Chris Jones and then Jean Robinson and then Tom Anderson. That's the way I looked around the room, and then Mr McCourt told me I hadn't looked over your way enough, but that's the order I'm going, if that's all right. Chris Jones, please.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I think I need to declare an interest because I work for the NHS. And here we go, really, the start of it all, isn't it? Yeah, I agree. I do think it's too early. The ICSs don't actually come into being until next year. And it is going to cause complications. I mean, I remember just the council night when people with declarations, you know, were involved when we were voting for whether wages should be increased in the NHS. And I think people as well start, I hate to say, but finding relatives who are perhaps not as close as they should be when declaring interests. But I would be very pleased if this could go over to the next municipal year, because I think it's just far too soon at the moment to be deciding this.
To call Jean Robinson next, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points, please. Does it also include, Mr McCourt, obviously, because obviously the ICS is integration with social care, not just an NHS, so would that not include any members that are involved in obviously social care, because it's integrated of the two, isn't it, really, not just the standalone as it is now at the moment, the two are separate. The other question I'd like to ask is, whilst I agree that it's perhaps a while off, it's perhaps not so much a while off on Partnerships Committee, because we are scrutinising it at the moment. I know I had these conversations that obviously we did some training as well, obviously I can't remember the lady's name, the consultant the other week. And one of her things about it, obviously pecuniary interest, was the fact is if you didn't speak to your brother, it didn't make any difference. That would still be that same interest. So it was even sort of family members beyond your actually immediate family in your own household. So I'd just like clarity on that, really, because also I know from the other day, there was sort of from Partnerships Committee, I'll use that as an example, that I was making phone calls to find out with some of the members on the committee, could they not take part. So if this is sort of pushed, it's 6 months it's coming in, obviously ICS is obviously in April, is the deputies, if they also involved in NHS, it needs to be looked at each committee that maybe would be looking at this more soon than the rest of the membership, to see if the deputies are also involved in the...
In terms of how those interests are looked at, it is interests of which the councillors should reasonably be aware. So, you know, quite rightly, you don't always know what your relatives are doing. In fact, sometimes we don't know what our spouses are doing half the time. So it is those things that we should be expected to know. We're not, the code isn't asking you to go looking under bushels, as it were, and ringing around all your long lost cousins and saying, do you work for the NHS? Because it's what's under your nose. The other part of that is it's an objective test. So it is what an other person, a member of the public, aware of all of the facts, would reasonably think. And for that, you might actually want to think a judge. This is always that separation of subjective bias and apparent bias. You know, a member will quite rightly say, yes, I know that that's going on in my life, but I can put that out of my mind. That's not how I approach this subject. And it's not about an individual member's integrity. It's about how it looks to the person out there. And that's why we use the term apparent bias, because it's how it looks to somebody it's a staged process. So the building blocks need to be in place for next year, then those will be developed. So conversations are going on now as to what this council's, this Wirral's place-based partnership between itself and providers and commissioners would look like here. So there was the workshop for your and other committees talking about the potential for a joint committee or delegation and so forth. But actually, you're quite right. Those decisions are for the ICB, Integrated Care Board, and that won't exist until April. So it's all a bit of a amusing, discussive feast and won't actually be real until this time next year. And in relation to the last point I picked up, which was what's different about the care sector as opposed to the NHS, is of course the NHS, as we say, is an arm of, a direct arm of the state as one conglomerate, as it were. Healthcare providers are individual and approach the council on very much a commercial contractual basis with real world commissioning and procurement, as it were, as opposed to a collaborative basis. So it's quite a different footing, and that's why it's been included from this, because that is a directly competitive commercial sector. Chair.
Does that help, Councillor?
It does. Could I just, if you don't mind, Chair, just ask, because obviously in this document it mentions about bias, financial bias, doesn't it? That the dispensation wouldn't come under financial bias, is that true?
No, the dispensation will be all-encompassing, so financial and well-being. So both the direct pecuniary interest, which is where the starting point, that financial interest. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Yes, there is built in an exclusion so that if it is directly affecting a personal contract, i.e. the council is sitting down and negotiating a contract with you or your business, then that's such an obvious, at that point, the consideration is that personal bias, that personal interest is so great, it would be seen to outweigh everything. And so that's excluded. That's my recommendation.
Sorry, Chair. Sorry, just the council or the NHS as well? Because in the document it says the NHS.
No, I mean for the council are concerned, i.e. their interest, yes.
Thank you.
This is like a snowball growing, or whichever rolling stone gathers no moss. In this case, this snowball's acquiring more snow attached to it as we go along, because we are, as a body, looking at Anderson and then Councillor Fowkes, if that's all right, and then I'll come back, look around again. Thank you,
Chair. I agree. It's snowballing, and I've got a few questions, but just on what Councillor Robinson said, my understanding of your answer there, Mr McCourt, is that if a general dispensation is granted, that doesn't preclude members the onus on them to declare that if it becomes that personal, whether it's in a financial or well-being way, then they still must declare that interest and leave the room. It still puts the onus on them to look at every item carefully and considerately, and that doesn't then stop them from declaring an interest and leaving the room if it gets that far.
Yes, Chair. The direct recommendation and the comment I make in the report is that, as said, if there is a direct contractual relationship, then the dispensation would not apply, and in any event,
members that are related, linked to the NHS, it is a lot in Wirral from all sides, whether they have a pension, whether it's a spouse, whether it's their children. That I think it becomes untenable if we don't grant this dispensation. I understand what Councillor McLaughlin says. I see where she's coming from. I don't agree with it. We've got the intricacies of the Local Government Act, haven't we? That actually gives a councillor less right than a member of the public, because you have to not be able to speak and leave the room at the same time. Now we are where we are. That is the law. But to lose any knowledge that all members have. There's no direct pecuniary link I can see at the moment. And the question then links to, from what's come out, the Health and Wellbeing Board. There's voting clinicians on that board that's going to be one of the bodies there that is going to be involved with the ICB, or I go for the contract. And at that point, do I declare is there then a pecuniary interest?
Forgive me, I only really picked up the one question, so please pick me up on that. Which was the last, which is, can there be a financial interest or a well-being interest in something that's going through Parliament at the moment, but isn't yet law? And the answer, I think, is yes, because, of course, we are all working on assumptions that have been published by government, that is the intention of government, and would be the outcome of that legislation. Whilst we may not know the fine details, actually we, and if I take it as a slightly different example, if this council is in a position to influence that legislation, and the result of that legislation is that an individual member who was party to that influencing, their well-being will be improved or made worse because of that influence, then they would have an interest.
Thank you. I think we need time to reflect on that, and perhaps we do have a session in private later on. We can reflect on some of these questions and answers perhaps more openly. Councillor Fowkes. Thank you.
Yes, Chair. I agree with Moira in as much as the legislation progresses, we would maybe not be in a position to allow dispensation at this particular point, particularly, and I don't like the idea of individuals being named in reports, but that is the fact we have in front of us. I do think, though, there is something of a sanitisation of the legislation going on. All we hear is it's about an integrated care system. If you actually go out and look at the legislation and what some of the implications are, it could well be the stalking horse for the privatisation of the National Health Service. And I'm trying not to draw us into the political debate, but clearly one of the first organisations that were effectively privatised were those of GP practices, which act as individual business units, and many complain about the deterioration of that service. So there will come points in the debate where the bill, warts and all, I know people don't want to discuss the nasty bits of it and just talk about an organisational change, but there are other parts of the legislation that we, or certainly I, will be campaigning against to get stopped. And when we come to that point, then individuals must look really closely at their position, particularly individuals who have what are effectively privatised businesses. So I think just to say I agree with some sort of delay and reconsideration until the bill progresses. There are many of us who don't want the bill to progress, and many of us who want the legislation to stop. Just like we campaigned against the planning laws, which have now been stopped by Michael Gove. So we do have a political entity within the council, and that's the point when the declarations of interest may be differently looked at. I just put that down. I'm not trying to make political points.
Yes, I'll just say, I did read the debate, the second reading in the House of Commons, where there was the opposition parties pretty well en bloc, were concerned about the legislation, didn't want to give it further legs at that time. Have I missed any calling anyone? Councillor Cox, sorry, I wasn't looking your way.
Thank you, Chair. Just like to come back on Councillor Fowkes' comments. First of all, Standards and Constitution Committee is a procedural committee. It's not really for political debate, even though that sounded like a political statement. Also, I tell you what, it also sounded like predetermination. So perhaps you would have to declare an interest and remove yourself from any of these debates, Steve, if you're actually on because we're meant to have an open mind when we go into these debates, remember. And again, that just comes back to what we were saying before. I think we're going to find ourselves on a very sticky wicket and very difficult circumstances when multiple people are going to have to remove themselves from the room because they have, be it tenuous or direct connections to the NHS and to the ICS for that matter. And that's something we need to seriously take into consideration, especially, I know there was talk and potential agreement on a delaying of this particular decision, but listening to what Mr McCord's just said with regards to being ready as well, I think it would be difficult to actually kick it into the long grass, because we need members to actually be able to be fully conversant and able to get involved in debates fully, rather than having to omit themselves from various items on an agenda. I think it's going to be farcical, actually, if that's the situation that we find ourselves in, and I hope it doesn't come to that.
You forgive me, I saw that Professor Jones was waving at me and pointing in a direction. Right, I'm sorry I didn't see Maura. Yeah, very kind. I'm trying to change glasses and see what's going on. Councillor McLaughlin, please.
Oh, changing glasses every 5 minutes, like I do. Just to bring us back, really, and away from what was starting to become an unpleasant exchange there. If we actually consider what we need to do at this point, we're not just considering, and as I say, I did not want to talk about the individual in too much detail because I think it's uncomfortable to do that in the public arena, that we've had long discussions about this particular councillor and the different roles that he holds. If we not just as a GP practitioner with his own business, but also as a senior member of the BMA, which is the trade union of the medical profession, given the level of uncertainty and the level of compromised positions that some people might be in, to park it for the time being and review it in 6 months' time when we've got a clearer idea of how compromised people may or may not be at that point. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to just check that our two independent members, I think Tom wanted to come back. Our independent members have any comments?
I would just go with what Councillor McLaughlin has said. I think it's rather premature to come to any firm conclusion.
Well, I'm the opposite. In April, you're going to have to make decisions. Now, how can you make them unless you start talking beforehand? But the other thing is, the person you're talking about is my doctor. I don't know what he's like, but he's got a lot of knowledge that could help us. Because if you look at the moment, we're getting knowledge from the newspapers and social media, and both of them are not trustworthy. And councillors usually are very good. So you've got a lot of people you're talking about who need dispensation, and they could give us a lot of good advice, so we know what we've got to do when this happens in April.
Tom, yeah, thank you. Councillor Anderson and then Councillor Chris Cook. Have I missed anyone? Sorry, I'm not looking that way. No, right. Yeah, right. Councillor Anderson, then Chris Cook. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I completely agree with that. You know, there's members across all sides who've got intricate knowledge, who've worked in the sector for decades, and in fact, in this room, that we'd want all views fed into. And we are just fudging the issue. If we kick the can down the road for 6 months, it's still going to be there, and we still have to make a decision. But just to be crystal clear, it might be me not understanding, but can Mr McCourt just outline his advice, the way I understand it, so correct me if I'm wrong, that anybody who works for the NHS, anybody who is a spouse of anybody who works for the NHS, children who may be in receipt of an NHS pension, have a disclosable pecuniary interest in terms of the ICB.
Right. Let's see what you can tell us, please, Mr. McCord.
So, Chair, I think I'd exclude pension because it's about somebody's financial interests or their well-being, and I can't imagine any restructuring affects somebody's pension, or at least hope not for when I get to that age. But that aside, sorry, forgive my humour. That aside, because it is those generic trusts, so there is that very high test of a disclosable pecuniary interest, which is where we start, which is where is somebody's financial, something on that register of interests directly affected, but that brings us into the criminal territory for the generic code of conduct, and by that I also mean the common law test for bias is a person or their family or close associate, is their well-being or financial interests affected to a greater degree than the general population, and is that interest of such an amount that a reasonable person knowing all of the facts would think their ability to make a decision in the public interest is tainted. So that observer. So yes, that would include quite a lot of members, and it would depend on what was actually being debated at that time and will affect those members over the coming months. Does that answer the question?
It does, I think, so the answer is yes, excluding pensions. A further question that's just come to me is, what about carers who receive a carer's allowance?
I can't quite see at the moment how they would be affected. But it's something to cross when we get to it.
Councillor Cook, please. Chris, thank
you.
Thank
you, Chair. Yes, I've been involved in many discussions leading up to this evening, and I've tried to, assimilate all the arguments. And I have to say that the points that people have made this evening have been valid. I'm uncomfortable about coming down on either side of the fence on this particular issue, to be honest. I think it is a very, very subtle issue. On balance, though, I do feel that I have to, oppose at this stage. I was going to say blanket dispensation. It's now an almost blanket dispensation, as has just become clear. I'd rather wait and see to find out what the impact of the, introduction of the ICS is from 1st of April. I don't think there is any mad rush. A gentleman mentioned, don't put off the discussion. Well, we're having the discussion now, as a prelude to what we might need to do in 6 months' time. I'd never say never, but I do think now is premature. But one point that nobody's made, which I think we should consider, is if a general dispensation is granted, two psychological impacts that may have. It could mean that members become complacent. They don't sort of consider each meeting, each decision on a case-by-case basis, and then perhaps don't withdraw when they really should, when there is a presidential interest, a pecuniary one, or they may feel under pressure to attend because of the dispensation, even though they feel they have a conflict with the conscience, possibly, And this could have a knock-on effect for other members in other committees. And we also have to consider what if there's another area of public policy, like, for example, next year, something to do with major educational reform. And we go through the whole rigmarole again of, well, who's a teacher, who's a governor? Oh, suddenly going to pay governors an allowance. Oh, heck, that's a third of the members or 2/3 that may have to, and so on and so forth. So that's all I would say. Very valid arguments, but I'd come down on the side of, putting off the decision to grant a dispensation. Thank you.
And members will have had in their pack for this evening. Oh, sorry.
Chair, I was
Councillor
named by Tony Cox, not for the first time. I'll repeat for the record, I am opposed to the privatisation of the NHS, and I also would do everything in my political power to oppose the progress of this bill that leads to more privatisation of the NHS. That's not predetermination, that's me having a political opinion. I will always consider every decision completely on its merits, but I am allowed to have a predisposition under the Local Government Act. So to try and accuse me of predetermination was a little bit unfair.
Right, I'm going to tread through this carefully. In our packs this evening, we have an item which is the copy of the Code of Conduct from our Local Government Association, which on page 77 is a flowchart. And essentially, throughout, I've endeavoured to be fair to all members who might or might not be caught by the system as it stands. I've tried, as members, the spokes will know, probably over about 3 weeks, or certainly since mid-August, to look at this situation, to look at what declarations of members have made. I've certainly taken into account over, 40 years, where members have expertise and knowledge which they brought to committees, which committees have appreciated. The step beyond that, though, is to ask ourselves, apart from that knowledge, as was suggested way things are going, would any member on any committee considering an issue have some knowledge and push something, whatever it is, in a particular direction which might, for the man on the number 1 bus going from Birkenhead to Chester, might on that journey think, well, it doesn't seem quite right. So this is why we protect ourselves and study the rules as best we can. And this is why Mr McCourt has brought to us this issue at this stage, though it mentions one particular member. Now, I've did this afternoon start writing some thoughts as a resolution for the committee. We then had a meeting of spokespersons, some exchanges over the last day or so where I'd thought I'd framed something that I believe was workable. We had some further discussion of spokespersons before this meeting. So that led me then to look at what I'd written and to go through some parts and think we need to look at them again. I've circulated it by email to a number of members since 5:30, but I've not been able to send it to our independent members because I don't believe I've got the email addresses. And I wondered if you might have those, Mr Sharples, to be able to give Professor Jones and Mr McCosh a copy somehow. But I think we need to look at what I wrote and look at what Mr McCourt suggested originally. Perhaps we should adjourn for a few minutes. I'm going to say till, say, 7:10 for members to look at what I circulated, to consider it, and then restart a formal committee. Do members feel that's appropriate? I think there's some nods going on there. I'm looking around the room. Councillor Robinson. Yeah, thank you, Jean.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just to sort of ask, would it not be, prior to making any decision, to look at how many members are actually impacted and their spouses, their sort of family that obviously that we know work in the NHS, because that will guide what we need to do really, rather than sort of guess. Because I still think, part of me is assuming this, that I think that some deputies, some committees are not going to have deputies either, because they have the deputies also have a connection with the NHS. So I think it's important that we look at that, because at the moment our constitution only allows named deputies to attend. So if those named deputies are also come under the NHS in some form, or their partner there, we need to look at that information. So maybe, if Mr Cork, that could be put together, because everyone declares their interests. And I think perhaps also from the training we had obviously last week, it may make people think obviously to increase those declarations, and then we can maybe look at that and then move forward. Because if we end up with 80% of councillors not being able to sort of take any part, whether it be now or in 6 months, before we come to any sort of motions or declarations this evening, that would be my suggestion.
Grows and gradually encompasses not just National Health Service, but caring and how things might progress in the future, and who decides gets what contracts where. Just to be clear on something that was raised, and I'll happily be put right, sometime in 1948 there was an agreement with the doctors, the BMA, that they would carry on working the way they did with the contracts they had remaining as private contractors. I think that was the deal. Happily go and look it up, but I believe that's the case, and probably somebody, Maura is going to got a hand that she might know. But my recollection was that the doctors are private contractors, and therefore, yeah. But I'll take Moira. You had a point. You were waving at me.
Well, not waving but drowning. But I just really wanted to address the point that Councillor Robinson's made, that there is so much uncertainty about what the decisions are going to be, who's going to be affected by them, how many of the councillors are. It actually makes the case even stronger for deferring any decision at this meeting tonight until that time, when we've got a much clearer picture of what the decisions are going to be, how they're going to impact on the services, and how they're going to impact on the individuals, and how many councillors are going to be affected by that. So I think it makes the case stronger to defer, if you don't mind me saying.
At the moment, I see no other hands. I suggested that we adjourn. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. McCall.
Just address Councillor Robinson's point, which is the only way we could do that is to have a hypothetical scenario and then survey all members to ask the question. Clearly we can look through register of interest, but registers of interests are only about that councillor and their spouse, and we can look at past declarations of interests, but of course that doesn't capture all members. So that's why we haven't put such a list in front of you. We gather what we could, and the obvious ones, as it were, comes to 15 members, but that's the obvious ones. But the only way we would know is by coming up with some hypothetical scenarios and going around and talking to all 66 members. And so that puts in quite a delay, and that's why we didn't do that before this meeting.
No, it does, but it's an email to 66 councillors saying, obviously they just reply, isn't it, and say from the training that everyone undertook and the slides were taken out, does this now impact? Because I think it has to be done anyway, regardless of the ICS. But I agree, it is a bigger exercise for tonight. When you've sent it, I've just got your email, Councillor Gilchrist, and actually that proves my point that actually on the partnerships, I'll use that committee, that most of the deputies wouldn't be able to attend for the people on that. So at least that committee, a committee needs to be looked at to sort of see where this is coming into place, because they are named deputies under the Constitution. So I don't know how that would work, if that's got to go back to full council, if that is the case. So I think that does need looking at from that email, because their spouse or their relatives would, as far as I'm aware, would be NHS involved. Thank you.
So I did suggest an adjournment. We've had a little bit more discussion since that. Should I suggest that we have a look at what I circulated in an adjournment and reconvene at 7:15? Would that help? Moira? Oh, right. Right. Can you get access, or can we perhaps print it off, Mr. Sharples, if you're able to get whatever number of copies we need and circulate them amongst members? And if members are happy with that, we then reconvene, and it's entirely a matter for Mr. Morgan whether he wishes to rejoin us at that time, because you can then see how we debate the matter further when we've just looked at some of the issues that have been raised. And I wondered if you would be courteous enough to leave the room for a bit while we have a chat. Thank you for your help and understanding. To contribute to the way things are going, and also urges that members are careful in so doing. Now, we have a number of items left. I don't propose to rush these, but I think that the content of them is well understood. I'm going to move on from item 5.
Minor update to the members' allowances scheme in respect to the special responsibility allowance for the independent member of the Audit and Risk Committee. That figure is £30, which aligns with the SRA for the co-opted members of the Constitution and Standards Committee. The second part of the report is an update on the progress made. Just to say the group met twice over the summer and they had a further meeting this afternoon considering a number of elements, but the two key ones that they've made progress on are in respect to the potential for I hope and anticipate to be able to submit a report to the next meeting, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we take on board what Mr. Fox has reported to us, there's a recommendation on page 19. This is got two clauses in. Shall I read it out for members? And with that? Yep. By assent. Thank you very much. Item 7 is the review of the committee system. Again, this is a rather more lengthy report from Mr. Fox, but I think the key to it is on the papers, page 25, where there is but we're asking in this a resolution again with two clauses, one of which refers specifically to the Local Government Association working with us. Now, I take it members have read the report, so I'll just see if any got any comments upon it.
Second, Chair.
Councillor Stewart, thank you very much. Now, can I see members agreeing with that, please? General assent? Yes? Thank you very much. Item 8 is another report on what as things stand, we're asked to note the report at the moment. Is that Chris, sorry, you're waving at me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just have a little concern that in the report on the work programming, referring to what you just mentioned, there's already a joint active travel working group set up. And this was already on the job, if you like, you know, working out the differences between the two committees with regard to active travel. That hasn't been set up yet. I would know if it were because I would be on it, you know. So I just want to make the point that the joint
to what the recommendation is. The current recommendation is the Constitution Standards Committee's recommendation to note the report, but I think it would help us if we added the issues referred to by Councillor Cook be drawn to the attention of the working party. I hope that would cover the points you've raised, because
yesterday, so you will be a party to that as well. But I don't think that there is necessarily a need for a working group to try and sort this out. I think the chairs need to be given an opportunity to do that themselves at this moment in time. Thank you.
I take that point. I'm sympathetic to what Councillor Cook is saying, but I'm now taking your advice. Because I think you're right.
Joint active travel working group. But I'm quite happy to accept what Councillor Stewart has made. I just wanted to make mention of it here. Thank you, that's fine.
Thank you. has been highlighted and is no doubt recorded on the webcast that the matter was raised, and therefore I take account of what Councillor Stewart has said. We leave the note, we note the report.
Unfortunate update.
Oh.
So just a very short piece of background, which is the as members know, that the LGA Model Code was published earlier this year. That was deliberately put forward as a catch-all for all parts of the country, for all cultures and backgrounds, and therefore subject to certain drafting. To meet all eventualities. In discussion weren't happy to bring back. So there were what we considered to be improvements to drafting, which you adopted. Both Beth Evans, as you heard, who provided training last week, commended that wording, as did the drafters of the model. The LGA has now produced guidance to its model to assist members further, to give scenarios and examples and so forth, and that's what here in the model code should have appeared in ours and don't. For which I genuinely apologise, members. It is only belatedly that I've had from the LGA the full version of those track changes and why. In all aspects to your code.
Just trying to make sense is the wrong word. We have 40 pages of guidance which members here have diligently worked through, including the flow chart, and thought boy oh boy, we've got home at last. Is it appropriate to say then that members receive this, await the corrections and will appropriately circulate it at a later stage?
the model code early in the next municipal year, because it's being embedded throughout councils over this year. They felt it was too early to do a review, particularly on the back of their recent corrections of errors, and we'll be doing a review in the next municipal year.
Right. So I think I've got it, and that is we approve the distribution of this with a us reach a resolution on this evening's business, which we're now able to send to council. Thank you for your help, all members, and thank you for the independent members for your contributions.